The Mimic first appeared in Gary Gygax's original monster manual in 1977 and was described as a creature that could not stand sunlight and was perfectly able to mimic the appearance of stone or wood. Ed Greenwood expanded on the specific details of the ecology of mimics in Dragon Magazine issue 75 published in July 1983. Although the article is only one page long, it established in the lore that mimics were a species with the potential for sapience and communication. But there is some diversity there. Some mimics are much more intelligent than others. Mimics are one of the iconic staples of Dungeons & Dragons, easily one of the most fun for Dungeon Masters, and therefore they have been tinkered with quite a lot over the decades with a whole menagerie of variants and expansions into their mysterious ecology. Hello, my name is AJ Pickett. I make deep dive lore videos on role-playing games, particularly monsters, and this is right in my wheelhouse. I've got a lot to tell you about mimics you may have never heard before. In this video, we'll be looking at the origins of the mimic, the basic ecology of their species, the life cycle, diet, reproduction, preferred environments, and the culture of mimics. Yes, you heard that right. We will delve into the metal mimic, the lesser common and greater mimic, the house hunters and more legendary examples of their kind, as well as the phenomena of colony mimics and mimic swarms. We'll also delve into more speculative details, and I will provide tons of inspirational ideas for how you can really get the most out of these amazing creatures to make your encounters far more than meets the eye, and thoroughly memorable for your players. So get comfortable, grab yourself a tasty beverage. Okay, make sure it's actually a tasty beverage before you grab it. And it's time to get deeply nerdy. Mimics are not mindless oozes, they never have been. They are complex creatures with a fascinating ecology. If you look at the most up-to-date stat block for them in 5th edition, you'll see they're categorized as monstrosities, not oozes. So what does this tell us about them? The core monster manual tells us that the term monstrosity is a catch-all category for creatures that don't fit into any other category type. Many scholars agree that mimics are the products of experimentation and mutation, most likely by those who study the arcane arts. They've taken some sort of naturally evolved creature, its origins unknown, and managed to enhance its unusual traits, and in some cases uplift its intelligence to a sapient level. The most common form of mimic is one most often depicted in fantasy art, appearing as a treasure chest of medium size made of stone or wood. So first, let's take a closer look at what makes the common mimic tick. A dead mimic is grey, smooth and amorphous, easily mistaken for a rock. It has internal organs in the form of chambers and layers of internal and external membranes with complex, very flexible patterns of multi-unit smooth muscles and very flexible arteries with evenly distributed complex autonomic neurons and this spongy spaghetti of tissue found all through these inner layers, particularly massed around the chambers, which serve as lymphatic, digestive and possibly cognitive organs. So very weird, but also fascinating and very tough, as the mimic is basically one big mass of redundant tissue with no vital organs. They remain pretty much fully functional until they have taken catastrophic tissue damage and their circulatory system shuts down. When alive, its outer surface can change its texture and to a limited extent its coloration. This was detailed in Ed Greenwood's Monster Ecology article, where he describes this coloration shift as the flow of dark brown fluid between inner and outer membranes, which causes the appearance of the mimic's skin to change from rock-like to wood-like. Common mimics have some difficulty in exactly matching the appearance of metallic objects because they can't produce a full range of colors and textures. Also, their natural form has a lot of small, dark spots on it that are the photosensitive eye patches it uses to see its surroundings. They can't shut these cells down, and thus exposure to bright sunlight is blinding and quite uncomfortable. So they just generally don't venture out into sunlight at all. Their skin is also highly textured with microscopic barbs that it can use with some precision. This allows it to appear to stick like glue to almost any surface and grip its prey so securely, tearing them free is quite difficult. The barbs in the skin surface can be condensed into hardened points quite easily, which is why they often appear to have a gaping maw full of razor-sharp fangs. These are not fangs at all, they don't have teeth, it's just tightly contracted skin with all of the barbs laying flat and locked together. Functionally, just as effective and quite intimidating. They know this and form these fangs deliberately. When they're simply feeding on subterranean vermin such as oozes, slimes and so on, they don't bother forming those sorts of structures. In addition to this, all mimics can secrete a very powerful organic glue and specific enzyme that dissolves these glue bonds so they can stick to things extremely well. It seems that the glue has something to do with the pigment fluid that moves between the membranes of the mimic's outer surface, and it's not activated by contact with air alone. Rather, there's some sort of mix of enzymes, so the mimics have very fine control over it. The common mimic is always a medium-sized creature. The reason being is that once they attain sufficient growth to the point where they are about to become a large creature, they reproduce by simply dividing in half, creating two mimics on the small side of medium-sized. The Underdark has mimics pretty much everywhere. They are very well adapted to living in the many different ecological zones of the world below the surface, which is much larger just by sheer area than the surface world, thanks to all the caverns and passages, rivers, lakes and oceans being stacked on top of each other. The Underdark of Faerun is simply enormous, much larger than people of the surface world think it is. There are whole civilizations down there that never come to the surface, such as the Orogs, the Petch, Deep Imaskari, and so on. Early mutations, either by planned experimentation or by exposure to exotic materials and energies of the underworld, resulted in two early variants of the common mimic. But I should point out there's always been a natural range of intelligence in all mimics. Some are little more than animalistic hunter-killers, others are quite capable of speech and negotiating for food, as food is always their primary concern. The mimic listed in the core monster manual for 5th edition is an animalistic killer variety, and unfortunately most new players to the game will have the false impression that this represents all mimics. It most certainly does not. It's just one of the most common varieties encountered in the Upper Underdark, where most adventurers from the surface world are likely to venture at some point. The Upper Underdark is actually one of the harder zones for creatures to find food on a regular basis. It's normally either very dry or too wet. The cave systems are frequently isolated or not large enough to support more complex ecological networks. It's a bit like the Upper Underdark is the alpine region above where the trees can grow, a bit of a wasteland before you reach the surface, and to the denizens of the deep Lower Dark, the surface world is pretty much outer space, a very alien environment for them. So the important thing to remember about the animalistic killer mimic is that its shape-changing abilities are a little limited. It can't become smaller or larger than it is, and it's only really able to appear as any form of stone or wood. But it looks exactly like an object made from those materials as long as it remains completely motionless, which they can. They don't even have a heartbeat and can recirculate oxygen-rich fluids internally, so they don't appear to breathe either. There was once an incident where a mimic posed as a statue in a busy market square in Waterdeep. It remained undetected for 2 years, feeding off stray animals and homeless humans and disposing of their bones down a nearby sewer access. The disappearances prompted an investigation that led to the death of 2 members of the City Watch who prodded the statue, even after they discovered the pile of bones that was 60 feet deep. Mimics can exactly match the appearance of any kind of stone or wood, but here is where things get much more interesting as we delve into the wider world of the variant mimics. What happens if a mimic doesn't divide when it grows to large size? What if their reproduction was a matter of choice and simply they chose not to in order to occupy a much higher rung on the food chain and take out larger and larger prey? That is where we get the house hunter mimics. They can grow to the size of cottages, taverns, inns, and much later we have legendary examples that can take the form of fortified structures, stone towers, and the like. The House Hunter first appeared in Dungeon Magazine, issue 19, in October 1989 in the adventure called The Vanishing Village, written by Marcus Rowland. This established the truly gigantic, even colossal-sized mimics were quite possible and very scary. It was not until many years later that the idea of colonies of mimics dwelling inside their enormous relatives was presented in the lore. Another early variant created by Gregory Detweiler for Dragon Magazine issue 101's Creature Catalogue is the Metal Mimic, described as a more powerful relative species. They can take on the shape and appearance of items of raw or finished metal. It can take on the colour, luster and texture of any pure metal, iron, gold, silver, platinum, etc., except for adamantite. They can't form into an alloy. Standard tactics of the creature including forming itself into a metal coffer to attract treasure seeking, or taking on the shape of an iron column in a passageway through which prey is expected to pass. The Metal Mimic can duplicate the effect of a light spell up to 4 times per day, causing the illumination to come from itself or from any object within 20 feet of its location. The Metal Mimic can exude a pseudopod connected to the main body by a slender tendril and shape that extremity into the form of a sword or dagger. With magical light placed on it, this extremity will appear to be an enchanted blade. If the creature wants to imitate a non-glowing magical weapon such as a mace or possibly a magic shield, it can project a form of Nistel's magical aura once per day, causing the imitated object to register positively if detect magic is cast upon it. The metal mimic has no use for treasure as such, but will often use the coins and weapons of previous victims to lure other prey, leaving such items where they've fallen and forming itself into a stone or iron column next to the pile. Like the common mimic, the larger they are, the more intelligent they become, and it's quite possible that there are very intelligent, giant-sized versions of the metal mimics as well, so perhaps think twice before crawling all over a massive golden statue to pry the gemstones from its eyes. The gems are probably very real, but simply held in place by the ever-hungry mimic, which is watching your character's every move, listening and understanding your character's conversation. You never know, perhaps it will talk to them if they figure out what it is before it gets to ambush and murder them, but they best have ready access to some large snacks on hand, or it's going to get pretty violent pretty quickly. Intelligent mimics are still predators. They think nothing of eating player characters. They're not evil for doing so, it's just how they survive. They don't do it with malicious intent, they do it for nutrition and often for resources to help them hunt for more food. May be disconcerting, but it's likely the best time to negotiate with a large mimic while it's crunching up the bones of your adventuring companion that it just ate. If you cease your attack and just talk to it calmly, it will probably reply. But make no mistake, your character is just talking food. When it gets hungry again, your character is right back on the menu. Villains who have a ready supply of minions to feed a massive and highly intelligent mimic have quite a good asset, and a means to keep themselves reasonably safe at the same time. The minions are not going to have a very good time though. So rule 1. The smaller the mimic, the more aggressive and stupid it is, which means they are fairly predictable. Rule number 2. Mimics are a hell of a lot more formidable than most dungeon masters run them, and for this I borrow heavily from my love of the superhero RPG genre, Spider-Man and Venom, or my own favourite hero, the amazing Amoeba Man, with all the proportionate powers and abilities of an amoeba. Mimics can rapidly form long adhesive pseudopods. They can flatten their entire body into a surface much like a flying squirrel, or glide through the air to form into a kind of parachute to slow their fall. They can extend into a serpentine form to move through tight confines, are not bothered by movement through flooded areas, foul air, and can withstand any sort of acidic environment. Their movement speed listed for the common mimic in the monster manual says 15 feet per round. But this is woefully short of what an intelligent and large mimic could accomplish. How fast can Spider-Man or Venom move through an environment with lots of surfaces to swing from? I can tell you exactly because I worked it out for my Amoeba Man character, and many fine physics enthusiasts have worked it out for Spider-Man as well. At full capacity, Spider-Man is capable of breaking the speed of sound, 767 miles per hour, thanks to his superhuman strength, web strength, swing arcs, diving at terminal velocity, air resistance, and so on. Normally he doesn't go anywhere near that speed. The city environment is just not ideal for it, plus the sound barrier depends a lot on air density and temperature. But we see glimpses of it in the movies, where he uses his web's elastic properties to slingshot himself across the Hudson River, which is something like 1 to 1.5 miles wide. That's one hell of a slingshot speed. Anyway, my point is, a mimic using its natural ability to move like Venom or Spider-Man could cover distances in the Underdark faster than just about any other subterranean corporeal creature I can think of, and I see nothing wrong with springing a combat maneuver on unsuspecting, complacent players that will make them shit their pants. When the mimic anchors itself, lashes out with multiple pseudopods onto one target and exerts its strength of 17 or higher for the larger types, and just slingshots that player character or poor NPC and impales them on some jagged rocks, or flattens itself out, shoves itself under the feet of all the player characters, then just gives a mighty flex and power pogs them right into the stone ceiling. Even better if there's a ton of pointy stalactites up there. Mimics could easily mimic the tactics of dark mantles, ropers, piercers, and use their pseudopods in exactly the same manner as the choker. They have excellent eyesight, dark vision out to 60 feet, and eye patches literally over their entire body, so their depth perception is accurate. That means they can grab rocks, dropped weapons, scooped up piles of coins, and snapped off stalagmites to hurl them as pinpoint missile weapons at their prey, enabling the intelligent mimic to take on groups of multiple characters quite easily. Yes, the common mimic is a basic ambush grappler that brutally overpowers one victim at a time and seeks to escape once its meal is overpowered, but that's not true of all mimics. Watch the fight scenes in the movie Venom and you will see exactly what an intelligent mimic is really capable of. Teach your players to fear them. It's your duty as a good dungeon master to demonstrate why the mimic is an icon of the game. Hey, it could be that the reason why giant mimics avoid spontaneous reproduction by splitting in two is because it never eats more than a bare subsistence level. Thus, you could encounter a mimic that very rarely actually eats large prey, like humanoid adventurers, and only fights to defend itself or to disable humanoid prey so it can eat them bit by bit at its leisure later on. So the mimic that takes captives and only fights to disable and subdue its prey. I'm also very much in favour of non-lethal resolutions that invite clever play and conversations between monsters and players. That's my chance as the Dungeon Master to put myself into the mindset and role of a very alien and quirky creature. I love it. Rule 3. Not all mimics automatically want to eat you, but most of them will if they have no reason not to. 2 more obscure facts about mimics. Alcohol can weaken the adhesive glue that they secrete, and they are immune to not just the acid attacks common to slimes, puddings, acids, jellies, and molds. They're also immune to spores and other such attacks, although not extremes of heat or cold, lightning, and so on. They eat all sorts of underground vermin, and that includes most forms of ooze monster. They also eat a lot of these creatures called berbers. You really need to know what berbers are. They are very common underground critters that a lot of experienced adventurers and underground merchants carry as pets. Berbers don't get much of a mention because they're not threatening creatures to humanoids. Berbers look very much like ivory and white reptilian grubs with 2 little dexterous forelegs, large black eyes, and a proboscis snout with suctioning mouthparts. They feed on oozes, moss, molds, spores, and fungus. They are completely immune to anything that ooze monsters can throw at them, and they make easy to care for pets. You can keep them fed on a decent meal of tree moss and moldy bread once per week. But they're always hungry, and when unleashed on a wild ooze, they are voracious and very tenacious. They're also one of the favoured prey of mimics, who will negotiate to eat a nice fat berber and let the player characters go on their way, or perhaps even take some of their stash of coins and magic items. They don't really have value for such items themselves, they just use them as bait. Berbers are cute and useful though, so it's not cool to just feed them to mimics, I'm just saying. Rule 4. Mimics eat berbers like candy. Spelljammer introduced the space mimic. These clever suckers emulate the appearance of desks of wizards, because magic is the primary way to get around in the Spelljammer setting. So space mimics try not to only attract food, but food that can cast spells and have lots of magic items on them, of course. Taking no chances, once within range of the space mimic, it will unleash mind-controlling hypnotic spell-like effects to ensnare its prey, getting them close enough to murder without its prey wasting all those precious magic items, weapons, armor, scrolls, potions, and other wondrous gear in a futile attempt to defend themselves. After gobbling down all the magic stuff, the space mimic will scoot off through space to digest its meals in peace and wait for its next victims, cleverly disguised as a wardrobe or something. Rule number 5. Never use the same disguised form of a mimic ever again, or at least until your players are completely complacent and it's the last thing that they expect. While we're at it, rule number 6. Your player character's perception checks, even natural 20 rolls, will not reveal the presence of a mimic, so perfect is their imitation of an object. An insight check is required for that, and in situations where the player characters have made a brilliant insight check rolling a natural 20 and has no idea why they are in extreme danger, make them save against becoming frightened, because they know that something is watching them, waiting to pounce, but they have no idea what it is. That is scary, folks. That adventurer is going to remain frightened of that area until they are moving rapidly away from it, or the source of their fear has revealed itself to them. In the meantime, they're at disadvantage on all attack rolls and ability checks, and they will not step 1 foot closer to the area that has spooked the hell out of them. Long before an encounter with a mimic, find out what the bonuses are for the player character's initiative rolls. Combat automatically begins the moment anyone becomes grappled by the mimic. For the common mimic in 5th edition, this happens whenever it is touched by a creature. If there is a group of mimics, which is rare but can certainly happen, particularly if a huge mimic recently reproduced into some medium-sized new mimics, the mimic group members may adhere to things like swords that are poked at them, or they may work together to tag team a target and take it down very quickly. The danger of mimics in combat is not immediately obvious, but let's break it down, shall we? First, there's a very good chance the mimic is going to have advantage on its first attack, and also whenever they have a target grappled, which is most of the time, if not all the time, they have a +5 to hit the target anyway. Chances are very high that they're going to land all of their attacks. Second, Their opponents, of size category huge or smaller, so any player character, have disadvantage to roll the DC 13 escaped check to break free of the grappled condition. This makes it quite difficult to escape from a mimic once it's got you, and makes the attacks from the mimic against the grappled victim very nasty. With those 2 dice rolls each round, the chances of scoring critical hits goes up. Mimics attack by either bludgeoning with their extended pseudopods, +5 to hit one target within 5 feet for 1d8 +3 bludgeoning damage, or they chomp an adjacent victim with a bite attack, also +5 to hit, inflicting 1d8 +3 piercing and 1d8 acid damage. The larger the mimic, the higher the 2-hit bonus and damage. Also, the further those pseudopods can reach. For example, a challenge rating 10 gargantuan-sized mimic is +10 to hit with its attacks. The pseudopods have a reach of 20 feet and inflict 4d12 +6 bludgeoning damage, and the enormous bite not only inflicts 4d12 +6 piercing damage and 4d12 acid damage, but a large size or smaller victim must make a DC 18 dexterity save or get completely swallowed by the massive mimic, getting rapidly dissolved by digestive acids that inflict a further 6d6 acid damage each round that victim is inside the monster. It's not easy to get out of a mimic the size of a house, which has nearly 300 hit points. The best hope is to inflict at least 20 points of damage to it from inside. However, while swallowed, a victim is blinded and restrained, so all their attack rolls are made at disadvantage. Luckily, this doesn't apply to damage dice rolled. Mages have experimented on mimics quite a lot historically. They still do, so you never know what sort of weirdness is going to pop up next. It might be a huge mimic that makes its way into a city and then sort of bursts apart, dividing many times rapidly into a whole swarm of tiny mimics that are not intelligent but quite sneaky, distributing themselves widely and finding ways to survive without drawing too much attention to themselves. So coming out of the sewers at night to dissolve street garbage, occasionally a rat, giant insect, or perhaps somebody's pet. Truly legendary mimics also exist. Mythical nightmares, such as entire dungeon complexes that are alive. The mimic is so immense it contains symbiotic creatures such as the Deepspawn and doppelganger caretakers who care for it and venture out into the world to lure adventurers back there to their doom. To the doppelgangers, the legendary mimic is a god, and its intelligence, ponderously slow thanks to the being's size, is at a genius level. The telepathic link it has to all its residents' minions extends for just over a mile. Can you imagine an illithid elderbrain managing to mind-wipe such a titanic creature and take its body over as a living fortress lair? Of course, as a medium-sized mimic can be quite intelligent, there's no reason why one should not be able to roleplay one as a player character, or have a special relationship with one as a companion creature, or even a wizard or warlock's familiar. Just remember, mimic player characters will have to have a pretty good excuse as to why they're not eating other humanoids on a regular basis. An acid-proof amulet of alternate form, a ring of sustenance perhaps. I leave it up to you to work out the specific, but the DM always has final say on something like that. My name, as I've mentioned, is AJ Pickett. I make videos every week about role-playing games, particularly monster ecologies, lore, the history of the game, world settings, and mostly it's Dungeons & Dragons, but I do sometimes delve into other role-playing games, narrate stories, and host live streams where you can ask me questions and listen to me rant about stuff. As always, thanks for listening, and I'll be back with more for you very soon. Let's not forget the important questions. Can you train a mimic not to eat people? Tricky, yes. Yes, once it's smart enough to understand you, but you have to feed it a lot to get it to the size where it can do that. And there's a chance it will divide and reproduce before you get there anyway, or not be in that size and trained for long enough to make it worth all the effort. Are they edible? No. They're all kinds of nasty, very acidic. They don't have chunks of muscle to eat. Their body tissue is really weird and gross. No amount of marinating, tenderizing, or cooking is going to fix that. About the only thing that likes to eat mimics is bacteria and other monstrosities, unnatural, creepy predators. Mimics are not useless, however. They can be captured and sold alive. You just, you get a good price for the right buyer. To up to 10,000 gold for a decent, secure specimen. Mimic flesh is also integral to potions of shape-shifting, polymorphing, and that sort of thing. Plus, of course, captured mimics can make for great travelling exotic beast sideshows, charging a copper to prod the thing hard with a sharp stick and see what happens. My most common modification for Underdark ambush predators is to put them in unexpected places on the surface world. For the Mimic, that would be the form of a fallen log that conveniently forms a river crossing bridge. Not only is it the perfect ambush, the Mimic can adhere to the victim and simply drop deep into the water below, drowning the victim long before the Mimic has even begun to be bothered by total immersion in water. Oh yeah, and Mimics do have their own language, so you can actually opt to learn the Mimic language if you really, really want to. But normally they can also just speak Common because they've observed and listened to other creatures speaking Common and learned it themselves. Also, as for Mimic culture, that because their intelligence isn't guaranteed and it's kind of questionable whether they maintain that intelligence when they reproduce, it's something that would sort of spontaneously arrive once they get to a certain size. So they get more and more clever to the point where they do have cognitive, sapient thoughts. I think, therefore I am. They have their own language, they have their own culture, but it's quite weird and different and very hard for anybody to ascertain if there's anything common to it, commonality. So mimics would recognize other intelligent mimics. They probably have territory. They have motives and goals of their own, but I can guarantee you they would mostly orient themselves around where do I get more food and how do we control our population so we don't eat ourselves out of existence. One of the more scary thoughts about a mimic colony and a network of intelligent mimics is that they could organize the unintelligent versions of themselves just by basically herding them, thanks to the mimic's instinctual proximity sense to a competing mimic, because they can't eat each other. So what they would do is basically show up and herd the unintelligent mimics into areas that they want them to go to. So what you'd essentially have is a shepherd intelligent mimic, which is shoving the less intelligent mimics into less traveled territory and saving the best routes most frequented by humanoid prey for itself. So there may be a higher likelihood, the higher the density of mimics becomes in an area of the Underdark, that you will actually encounter the intelligent mimics more often than not. And when you go into the less traveled areas of the Underdark, that's where you get the more predatory, stupid mimics. And of course, the intelligent mimics will make their way to the surface world because they will have learned about concentrations of humanoids called cities. And in the Underdark, of course, there are also large cities, particularly of drow and duergar and deep gnomes and that sort of thing. And of course, the Orogs.